Good day, and thank you for the great job that you've been doing in this module regarding ethics. What I wanted to do a presentation on is an element called the corruption continuum, which I wanted to provide to you. This is from a book called The Ethics Edge that's put out by the ICMA Press, and it's edited by Jonathan West and Evan Berman. And both of them are pretty prominent authors in the area of ethics and creating ethical organizations within the public sector. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit is about, what causes corruption within an organization and what we can do as public sector leaders to prevent corruption from occurring within our organization. And I know we talked a little bit about it in some of our readings in some weeks, but I just wanted to get into some more depth about it because I think as leaders, there's a great deal that we can do to prevent it. We know that a lot of times these scandals that we know about and read about can be prevented. Usually, they result from an evolution of both predictable and preventable circumstances. In fact, virtually every significant case of employee misconduct has involved warning signs that leaders either ignored or failed to recognize as important. Leaders themselves are at the core of both the causes of and the solution to corruption. Past research has repeatedly confirmed that most scandals start with relatively small, unethical acts and grow to whatever level the leadership allows. It now is understood that administrators play a much more direct and powerful role in the prevention or promotion of misconduct than previously thought. This concept of the rotten apple theory that some administrators have proposed as the cause of their demise has usually been nothing more than a self-serving facade. And a great example of this is when we had the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in which leaders accepted highly unethical treatment of prisoners, Iraqi prisoners, in sex scandals in that case. And the U.S. Army said it's just a few rotten apples that were involved in that scandal, when in fact there was a whole bunch of people in leadership positions that knew about what was happening and did nothing to stop it. So this whole idea of the rotten apple theory is actually a facade, and it's intended to draw attention away from the failures of the leadership within the organization. So what I wanted to do is talk about this thing called the corruption continuum. And there's a number of phases that I think are important because I think within your own organizations or with things that you see in the news or in reports, you can probably see how this continuum plays out in building a highly unethical organizational culture and unethical conduct with employees or with leaders. In phase one of the continuum, it's called there's administrative indifference toward integrity. Many administrators are instantly resentful and defensive even at the inference that they are or have been indifferent to ethics or integrity issues within their organization. But actions, in fact, speak louder than words, which we have clearly learned about in our leadership module. The reality is that most workplaces are filled with employees who never have had ethics training, and the vast majority of workers, especially in America, feel far more stress from rampant backstabbing, internal politics, hidden agendas, and blatant unfairness than they do from simply doing their jobs. At first glance, it seems illogical that upper administrators of any organization would not be deeply committed to maintaining a high level of organizational integrity and ethics. After all, employee misconduct leads to civil lawsuits, negative publicity, ineffectiveness, and it's devastating to morale. Chief administrators who have found themselves terminated will confirm that these and similar circumstances were used to justify their terminations. So what are some of the things that can show you that there's maybe indifference in the organization? Some of these indicators include a low quality of recruitment and hiring within the organization, Also, the perception by employees or volunteers that discipline or promotion is unfair. There's disgruntlement among training officers or amongst the people who are educating your employees or play a key role in supervising and training your employees. And the last item that's an indicator is there are supervisors who treat people with a lack of respect on a continual basis. So those elements make up administrative indifference toward integrity. In phase 2 of the continuum, there is negligence of obvious ethical problems. Because it is clearly in the best interest of an administrator or leader to prevent misconduct, why aren't leaders more dedicated to stopping unethical behavior? They know it's happening, that even if it's a rumor about the same person, you would think that they would do something about it. In this phase of the continuum, leaders who are not committed to integrity can be categorized into 3 distinct levels according to their behaviors. At the least harmful level, there are leaders who don't devote resources to enhancing or maintaining ethical standards, but are not negative role models in themselves. So they're not necessarily doing unethical things or poor role models, but they're not doing anything to enhance or maintain ethical standards. They might even be ignoring those standards. At the second level of severity, leaders are intentionally looking the other way and ignore acts of indiscretion by workers or volunteers, even though these acts continue to grow in seriousness and frequency. So in level 2, they knowingly and willingly ignore bad behavior. And then finally, the most despicable leaders are those who cover up misconduct rather than admit the truth and attempt to rectify a situation internally without any form of investigation. So they're trying to hide everything so as to cover up the misconduct. The failure of leadership to address internal integrity needs is more than just indifference at this phase, because the needs are more recognizable and serious. Intentionally ignoring obvious ethical problems primarily arises out of one of 2 problems. There's either a lack of knowledge or a certain self-centeredness. Although these leadership failures usually lead to devastating consequences, they can be prevented and corrected. So, in some cases, when we talked about lack of knowledge, it means that administrators don't act or don't do anything about the misconduct because they don't know what they can do or what they can do to prevent it or stop it. And this idea of self-centeredness is that leaders don't do more about clear ethical problems is because they believe that bringing attention to their integrity needs could hurt them personally. So they figure their organization will become under scrutiny and criticism, and all of it will fall on their shoulders, and they choose to hide it or whitewash it rather than bring it forward for investigation. So this is, negligence of obvious ethical problems is clearly something we want to avoid and deal with as leaders in our organization. So as we move on the continuum, phase 3 is the creation of hypocrisy, the idea that hypocrisy and fear are dominant in the organizational culture. We talked about ethics and building an ethical organizational culture. In organizations that have corruption that's pretty pervasive, there is, in fact, an organizational culture where fear is the dominant feeling of the day. This phase of the continuum is only possible after an administrator has orchestrated several years of indifference and deliberately ignoring the ethical needs of its organization. This phase is characterized by several clear symptoms that must be resolved, or the likelihood of significant corruption will be imminent. Let me repeat that. At this phase, this has been occurring. Unethical issues have been occurring for many years, and leaders, including board members and executive directors, have allowed this behavior to happen. And it must be drastic action has to be taken to resolve it, or there will be more significant corruption will be imminent. And I think that is absolutely critical to understand. So let's talk about the major idea that fear is dominant in the culture. By this stage of the evolution, fear has manifested itself in several forms. The most harmful consequence of fear occurs when an administration's role modeling of ignoring integrity problems prompts the majority of supervisors to ignore them too. So if those in executive level positions ignore integrity issues and ethical issues, then all of the mid-level managers and direct supervisors will also begin to ignore them because they fear retribution or demotion or other things. In addition, although this idea is never found in a policy manual, every manager or supervisor knows at this point in the continuum that politics and hidden agendas decide which leaders will continue to be promoted and which will be ostracized or pushed aside. Thus, if you want to prosper or even merely survive as a leader, you are forced to abide by the unwritten rules of internal politics. This frustration of being treated with such disrespect and hypocrisy causes supervisors to discredit administrators in front of employees. What begins as indifference has grown into a cancer, destroying morale, productivity, and dedication. So this creates an environment of fear. The other environment that is created is this issue of extreme bitterness. Because all employees want to be treated with dignity and respect, an indication that serious misconduct has begun within a workplace is that employees have become deeply resentful over the way they are treated. Overt warning signs of this degree of resentfulness are constant and harsh criticism from large groups of people. So if the vast majority of your employees are criticizing the organization, whether it's on social media or around the water cooler, and that's a lot of people complaining, that shows extreme bitterness. In addition, there's oftentimes open defiance of administrators, particularly in meetings, and the disregarding of orders or tasks or mission assignments. When extreme bitterness is also present, workers who rationalize doing unethical things during conversations with one another. So you'll hear workers talk about doing unethical things to others and rationalize it as a result of the organizational culture. And then finally, there's a feeling of this sense of hopelessness when workers no longer believe there is any hope for improvement or relief from their unbearable working conditions. They can justify carrying out unethical acts that would have been unthinkable to them in the past. If people are robbed of their dignity by insecure supervisors and find themselves surrounded by the everyone else is doing it mentality, misconduct is guaranteed even by some of your best employees. So, phase 3, this idea of having hypocrisy and fear dominating the organizational culture requires us to act immediately. And now the last phase of the continuum is phase 4, called survival of the fittest. The ultimate level of the continuum of corruption is dominated by the pervasive intention of most employees to do whatever it takes just to survive. While the particular circumstances dictate the specific forms of misconduct, several common denominators exist among organizations that have reached this phase. Amongst these traits or characteristics of organizations in this phase include the administrator's lack of knowledge on how to prevent unethical acts, combined with his or her refusal to address such prevention, blocks any attempt to enhance integrity. In addition, good, honest employees fear the corrupt dishonest ones. So that goes back to phase three. So you have some honest employees, and they're always living in fear from those who are corrupt and dishonest. In addition, another characteristic is that this organization has a long tradition of ignoring misconduct and has convinced employees that leaders want misconduct covered up rather than exposed or corrected. In addition, in these organizations, the code of silence is both condoned and privately encouraged. So if there's a code of ethics, it's largely ignored, and you remain silent in the face of misconduct and gross abuse and and unethical behavior. Also, there's a predominant unwritten priority to keep corruption out of the newspapers at all costs. So, if you go and speak to people outside your organization or to the media or in some other way report it to a specific watch group, for example, you will be disowned by the organization. And you should not be doing that. And finally, the people in the organization um, know that and believe that the situation will not get any better. So, in this phase, there's rampant, really unethical behavior and corruption occurring from the rank and file all the way up to the highest levels of the organization. So these are things that you don't want to see in your organization. And as a leader, you want to be able to attack these things at each one of these phases if you can. And if not, get assistance from other people. So, what are some of the best solutions to some of the corruption that may be occurring within an organization? First and foremost, ensure you do high quality background investigations for those that you hire for staff as well as for volunteers. You're hiring, something as important as the hiring process, like the background check, is very important. In fact, the best predictor of future behavior has been and will always be past performance. Consequently, the most crucial requirement for us, this is a crucial requirement for a superior background investigation. And so you get an idea of the character of the people that you are hiring. Very important. For solution two, make sure you have a high quality training program for both your volunteers and staff. It is a disheartening fact that, as a national standard, there for many decades that many organizations just simply don't have any type of ethics training for their newly trained individuals or for their volunteers. And so having a training program that tells people about their expectations on the job, their expectations of the organization, the mission, what you value, as well as the ethics training is highly important. Solution three is fight political interference. This idea of political favoritism and interference have always been detriments to almost any organization. Although it probably isn't as extreme today, we know that this idea of having attacks, from people outside the organization, whether they're donors or such like that, or government agencies, this fact that we shouldn't be indifferent to some of the unethical things that are going on in terms of the politics around our environment. So try to fight this political interference as well, because it's very, very demoralizing to individuals. Another one is solution four is ensure consistent and fair accountability. A lack of accountability is destructive to the culture of an organization. Ethical accountability will be one of the most used means of preventing unethical acts in the next decade and throughout your work within the nonprofit sector. Acknowledging that there is little or inconsistent accountability in an organization is particularly painful for any leader, as these leaders are probably the ones who are to blame. Thus, it's really important for board members and upper administrators and leaders to make sure that they take action and that it's taken as a group effort, to not necessarily blame everybody, but ensure that you have some type of accountability system in place, which we'll be learning about accountability in Module 3. Uh, in Solution 5, as I talked about before, conduct effective ethics training. Mandate that all of your employees and volunteers take this training and review your own values and the ethical dilemmas that they're likely to face while providing service to your clients, regardless of where they are in the world. And many organizations also have anti-corruption training as well. Please do those. These are great ways of preventing corruption in an organization. And then Solution 6, as we've learned in our leadership module, is accept nothing less than positive leadership role models. Supervisors and leaders act as trainers, counselors, and mentors for all employees and volunteers. As a result of their constant contact and formal power, they become major role models. The importance of this relationship is vital in developing such traits as sincerity, loyalty, honesty, respect, and dedication. Role modeling is a leader's greatest single source of power. Actions do speak louder than words. It is impossible for any organization to be filled with integrity if line supervisors and everybody and others in the chain of command are unethical. For role modeling also can be used to instill corrupt behavior. So as we learned in our leadership module, this is a critical role to prevent corruption. And then finally, the last is prevent your staff and volunteers from feeling victimized. As this continuum develops, shows that employees perceive a sense of victimization can commit progressively worsening ethical acts. This perception of being victims makes it easier for them to rationalize their misconduct. So when you have staff and volunteers who are feeling this pervasive sense of being victimized year after year after year in this unethical climate, then they can rationalize that it's all right for them to also act in a way that's unethical. So I wanted to just share this with you. Please use it. Let me know what you think. And I hope you're able to use this in your own leadership practice. Thank you.